Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We're going to get started in just a few minutes as we get more folks to join. So if you just sit tight, we'll start in a few minutes. Thank you. Thank you for joining. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Okay, terrific. Well, welcome to the 7th webinar in the 2018 Climate Tracking and Transparency webinar series. My name is Kelly Levin. I'm from the World Resources Institute, and I'm going to provide a brief introduction. I'm joined by Pauline Hill, who is supporting the management of the GoToWebinar platform, and we have two excellent presenters who I'll be introducing shortly. Today's webinar is going to focus on the benefits of investing in national monitoring and evaluation systems for climate change adaptation and go beyond narrow project or indicator-based monitoring systems. The webinar series is co-organized by World Resources Institute's Tracking and Strengthening Climate Action Initiative, or TASCA, together with the Partnership on Transparency in the Paris Agreement, known as PATPA, in order to share existing knowledge and best practices related to improving domestic transparency systems. If you go to the next slide. On today's webinar, I'm going to provide some basic instructions for participations. I'll provide a brief overview of the TASCA project and PATPA initiative, and also introduce the panelists. Presentations are going to be followed by a question and answer session where attendees are going to be able to submit questions directly to the panelists. And at the close of the webinars, a short survey is going to be launched for you to answer some quick questions as well. During this webinar, attendees are going to remain in listen-only mode. Participants can raise comments or questions throughout the webinar by typing them into the question pane in the GoToWebinar control panel. And if you're having trouble with audio or video, please send a message in the GoToWebinar panel or to Pauline Hill at pauline.hill@wri.org, who is running today's webinar. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available online after today. So just first some background on our project, which is hosting the webinar series along with PATPA. The TASCA project is managed by WRI, and it aims to support governments to be able to transparently communicate progress towards NDCs, meet international accounting and reporting requirements, and account for their commitments, and identify additional abatement opportunities to support national dialogue on future commitments. We're currently focusing in 5 countries: Colombia, Ethiopia, India, Indonesia, and South Africa, and specific activities depend on each country, but lessons learned and resources developed are shared globally. In addition to our work in country, TASCA actively supports enhancing international transparency, and we provide research and analysis to support the negotiations and convene dialogues and discussions with country parties to consider different options. We're also developing new tools and data platforms to support analysis for decision-making and tracking implementation. If you go to the next slide, PATPA, or the Partnership on Transparency in the Paris Agreement, was launched in 2010 at the Petersburg Climate Dialogue by South Africa, the Republic of Korea, and Germany. PATPA promotes ambitious climate action through practical exchange on enhanced transparency to support achievement of the global temperature goal. PATPA supports its mission through policy dialogues and convenings to build capacity and encourage peer exchange and develop research products to disseminate knowledge. If you go to the next slide. Now, to get into the core of today's webinar, I'm going to hand over to our panelists. First, Nick Brooks with Garama 3C, who will set the scene by introducing the topic and why it's important to invest in national monitoring and evaluation systems for climate change. And then Neha Rai from IIED Climate Change Research Group, who will ground some of these concepts by sharing how concepts are nurturing national monitoring and evaluation systems and what positive and negative lessons we can draw from these examples. So if you go to the next slide, on behalf of TASCA and PATPA, welcome Nick to start off his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kelly, and welcome everyone. There's the slide. So before we talk about the need for adaptation, Emily, at the national level, I think it's worth spending a little bit of time thinking about what we mean by adaptation and what successful adaptation actually looks like. So I'm sure we've all come across definitions of adaptation related terms, where adaptation is defined essentially as adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects. Now, of course, adaptation is very closely linked with some other key concepts, such as those of resilience, vulnerability, and adaptive capacity. Now, these are quite abstract terms, which cause a lot of headaches for people, including me a lot of the time. But they do have specific definitions. For example, resilience is generally viewed as the capacity of a system to cope with a hazardous event, such as a climate stress or shock, a climate extreme, and to cope with that event or stress while essentially maintaining its basic character, integrity, and function. So very much connected with the idea of bouncing back, or in development terms, people like to talk about bouncing back better. We don't want people to bounce back into poverty, for example. Vulnerability is generally viewed as the propensity or disposition to be adversely affected. So it's a system's tendency to be harmed when it's exposed to a shock or stress. But there are lots of different definitions of vulnerability, and some of these are quite confusing and even a little bit contradictory. And I think that's one of the reasons that we have a lot more focus on the concept of resilience now. Finally, adaptive capacity, which is fairly self-explanatory, but it's the ability of a system to adjust to changes in climate and to respond to the consequences of climate change and any damages or even opportunities that may arise. So generally, people talk about successful adaptation as being actions that improve resilience, increase people's adaptive capacity, or reduce their vulnerability. And that's all very well, but I think that's not the end of the story. What's often missing in the discussion is how adaptation is linked to development, believe it or not. So improved resilience, reduced vulnerability, and increased adaptive capacity are not ends in themselves. They are a means to an end, and that end is to secure development in the face of climate change that might otherwise undermine or even reverse it. So what we're talking about when we're talking about adaptation is actions that enables us to achieve desired development goals and to secure and improve human well-being despite climate change and its impact. So that's what we're talking about with successful adaptation. We're talking about how we secure those development objectives that we want, such as meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. And we're going to have to do adaptation if we want to meet those goals. Next slide, please. Thank you. So based on that very general understanding of adaptation, linking it to development, we can come up with a generalized theory of change for adaptation, if you like. And what we have here on this rather busy diagram is such a theory of change that talks about adaptation in terms of results as related to outcomes, impacts, and outputs. So this diagram is actually based on a simplified theory of change that was developed for the BRACED program, which is the DFID Building Resilience and Adaptation to Climate Extremes and Disasters program. And once we know what we mean by successful adaptation, we can start unpicking that and looking at the adaptation process. So we're looking at adaptation here in terms of outputs, outcomes, and impacts. Outputs are essentially the goods and services delivered by an adaptation intervention. Outcomes are the short to medium term changes that result from those outputs, and impacts are the longer term changes that we want to see, the ultimate objectives, if you like, of adaptation. So here we're talking about impacts in terms of the desired development achievements and improvements in human well-being that we mentioned on the last slide. So inputs might be things like the money put into a program or a project, number of personnel days, etc. When talking about outputs, we might be measuring things such as the funds that have been dispersed, the number of beneficiaries who have been targeted or received support, the number of units of something installed, for example. When we're talking about outcomes, this is where we begin to look at the changes that those outputs deliver in terms of improved resilience, reduced vulnerability, and enhanced adaptive capacity. And we often look at these things in terms of changes in people's assets, their characteristics, the characteristics of a system, changes in people's or communities' access to resources and services, and so on. Changes that we think will make them better able to cope with climatic stresses, shocks, and trends in the future. And when it comes to impacts, we're talking about measuring impacts in terms of often regular indicators that measure development performance or human well-being that we might be very familiar with, but trying to measure these in response or in relation to climate stresses and shocks as represented by climate indicators. So just to try and illustrate this with a simple example here in the graphic, we might have an initiative that seeks to address the impacts of drought on livestock in a semi-arid area. This might be achieved by trying to improve access to water for livestock. So here the outputs would be the number of water sources constructed for livestock use. The outcome, something that we can measure in the short term, even the absence of climate shocks, would be, for example, the number of livestock that have access to water in the dry season, a normal dry season, for example. So we think if we generally have better access to water when it comes to a drought situation, livestock will be better off. And the ultimate impacts in terms of this particular intervention would be changes in the number of livestock either surviving or dying when faced with an extreme climatic stress such as a drought. So we have a sequence of measures that try and look at the success of adaptation in the sort of very short to medium and longer term. And the last of these is measured in relation to climate stresses. Next slide, please. Thank you. So hopefully now we have a very broad picture of what we mean by adaptation success and how we can relate that to outputs, outcomes, and impacts, the type of things we think about when we're developing M&E systems. So we want to think about how and why we apply this sort of thinking at the national level. And there are at least 4 key reasons for doing adaptation M&E at the national level, just listed here. I'm going to talk about each one in turn, so I won't dwell on them on this slide. But essentially, if we're doing national level adaptation, then this can help countries to track national adaptation actions and activities and performance, for example, against milestones. And this will help with accountability, for example, to citizens, and might also help generate other information for other reporting. M&E systems help us to learn what works and what doesn't, particularly if we're looking at the more sort of output and outcome and impact related indicators, and learning is very important for informing planning and programming. Another thing that's important is integrating adaptation into wider development practice, and we can develop M&E systems that help us track the extent to which this is occurring. And finally, national level M&E systems can help us generate information that can be used to feed into global reporting systems, such as the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about tracking adaptation progress at the national level for accountability for citizens and to generate information and data that might feed into global reporting systems, what are we talking about? Well, we can look at progress measured against national development goals and milestones and commitments, for example, those enshrined in nationally determined contributions and other plans, adaptation plans, climate change action plans, and so on. We can use it to track what policies are in place and in development across a number of sectors, for example, important for looking at what mandates there are for adaptation action and for the enabling environments that are required for adaptation action to be successful. We can look at the progress in mainstreaming adaptation into different sectors, which sectors have adaptation plans, for example, and we can look at the amount of development spending that is targeted in adaptation relevant or climate sensitive areas. We might also track the proportion of the population that are receiving direct or indirect support from adaptation actions or adaptation relevant development actions. So all of this information can be used to tell a story about what a country is doing in order to deliver adaptation to its citizens. Next slide, please. A really important function of M&E at any level, at any scale, is learning. And we urgently need to have a better understanding of what sort of adaptation actions work, what don't work, and why. So here at the national level, we might have some sort of system for asking what changes we're seeing as a result of adaptation actions. For example, where and as a result of what initiatives are we seeing things like enhanced resilience, enhanced adaptive capacity, and reduced vulnerability? And we might track changes in these factors in resilience, vulnerability, etc., by looking at essentially predictive indicators that are based on people's capacities, their access to assets, resources, and so on. Not next slide, but if you just bring up the next bit of text, please. So the other thing we want to look at in the longer term is how is adaptation contributing or not contributing to sustainable development. So here we'll want to, on the one hand, keep a track of how the climate is changing, how are those shocks and stresses changing, and we'll look at things like impacts, losses and damages related to climate extremes, for example. Are these getting worse? Are they getting better? Are we realizing those desired development outcomes despite climate change? And if so, what can we say about the role of specific adaptation actions? So here we're going to be looking at things like indicators of losses, damages, development performance in climate sensitive sectors and so on over the longer term. And we can use indicators that are often gathered by national governments just to track their development performance and put these in more of a climatic context. So next piece of text, please. And ultimately, what we want to look at here is not just what adaptation actions are being successful and where we're seeing these successes, but why do adaptation actions succeed or fail? What is the role of enabling environments, the role of policies, of capacity building activities, and so on. Next slide, please. So another very important function of adaptation M&E at the national level will be to help drive the integration of adaptation into wider development. As I've already mentioned, all aspects of development need to consider the potential impacts of climate change, and all development will need to look at the extent to which it needs to integrate adaptation if it's going to achieve things like the Sustainable Development Goals. So if we build adaptation indicators into wider development M&E systems, then we can actually track the success of doing adaptation as part of our wider development activities. For example, we might look at the extent to which things like Sustainable Development Goal 13 on climate change are being reported on across different sectors. We might look at the extent, again, across different sectors or areas to which development programming and planning explicitly considers climate risks. Are there, for example, screening mechanisms there? We might try and track the proportion of development spending that is adaptation relevant and that includes specific adaptation actions. And then we might report against specific climate relevant development performance indicators, for example, in the areas of health, nutrition, water resources, and so on. And so by doing this, we can track how development at large is addressing the adaptation challenge. So one of the key questions here is, how do we do this? And I think Neha is going to talk a bit more about this in her section. For example, are we looking at existing national development M&E systems that might then start to include adaptation-related indicators and evaluations? Or are we, as we see in a lot of cases, looking at standalone adaptation M&E and trying to link this to wider development issues after we've developed those adaptation M&E systems? So I think this is a critical question. The next slide, please. And finally, one of the reasons from an international perspective, the perspective of international coordination to invest in national M&E system for adaptation, in addition to all the hopefully very useful functions it will serve within a country, is to generate information that can feed into these global reporting systems under agreements such as the Paris Agreement. So under Article 7 of the Paris Agreement, which relates to adaptation, there are a number of activities that will require some reporting. For example, we have the global goal on adaptation, which is to enhance adaptive capacity and resilience, reduce vulnerability with a view to contributing to sustainable development, and ensure adequate adaptation responses in the context of the temperature limits set by the Paris Agreement of 1.5 and 2 degrees. So this mandates countries to take particular actions, and they will be expected to some extent to report on what these actions are. There are adaptation communications defined under the Paris Agreement, which will detail parties, in other words, countries' adaptation priorities, plans, actions, and needs. We also have the transparency framework, which requests parties to provide information on climate change impacts and adaptation actions. And from 2023, there'll be a global stock take, which seeks to, as the word implies, take stock of what actions countries are taking in order to meet their commitments under the Paris Agreement. So what we have is a whole host of reasons for doing national level adaptation M&E to deliver accountability to transparency, for example, to its citizens, to report upwards to global frameworks, but also to try and learn what's working, what's not working in a country to inform programming, and to try and improve the extent to which adaptation and considerations of climate change are integrated into development at large. And I think these are all very sort of critical reasons for doing M&E of adaptation at the national level. Some of them more sort of outward looking in terms of reporting and sustainability or transparency and accountability, whereas others serve a very real and tangible function of actually driving better programming and planning that does take account of climate change. So I'm going to finish there and hand over to Neha. So I don't know if Kelly wants to do a little segue from one section to another.
No, terrific. That was great, Nick. Thanks so much. Yeah, let's indeed, just in the interest of time, go straight to Neha's presentation. What we're going to do is take all questions and answers at the end. So again, if you see the questions tab in your menu, I already start to see one question, and feel free to put that in. We'll collect that at the end, and then after Neha's presentation, we'll have a little bit of time to do Q&A. Thanks. Over to you.
Thank you, Kelly. Hi, I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you for joining the webinar. I'm Neha Rai, a senior researcher with IID, currently working on a project which focuses on transparency theme funded by the SPA program, support for implementing the Paris Agreement, which is a collaboration with GIZ and the BMU, the German ministry. While Nick's presentation clearly sets out the benefits of investing in national M&E system, I will take you through some concrete examples of how countries are nurturing national M&E systems and how countries can learn from these examples, both for better planning as well as reporting under the Paris Agreement. I think, next slide, please. I think this discussion is rather important and also timely, as we all know, in 2015, three main framework agreements emphasized the importance of investing in monitoring and evaluation. And this broad focus on M&E across different agreements, such as the Sendai framework, the Paris Agreement, and the SDGs, offer both an opportunity and a risk. Opportunity because the international community is investing in M&E capacities in developing countries, poses a risk because countries are faced with a challenge in terms of developing statistical systems, M&E arrangements. It could lead to widespread duplication of efforts, double counting in reporting, and also it can be quite resource intensive. So next slide, please. I think it's good to look at what countries are already doing and what approaches they're using to build on their national M&E systems so that they can harness existing arrangements for both reporting and planning for these framework agreements. Under the SPA program, we did an initial review of existing work on examples of countries that are investing in M&E systems. So the examples that I will share are based on what organizations like GIZ and IID have already been reviewing for the past many years on M&E systems, and we will be deep diving into understanding what is their current situation in the next phase of the work. So I would like to provide this context because so that you're aware that we are not able to share the current overview, but more what is there in the literature. These examples are quite important, not only because they're successful examples, but because they offer interesting trajectories which we can learn from. So they have their own pros and cons. As we all know, there is no one size fits all approach to M&E systems. As countries develop ways to report against different framework agreements, they can draw on experiences from these cases depending on their country context. So looking across national M&E systems so far, we can see 4 to 5 main typology of systems that are that are emerging. One, countries that have developed national M&E system, particularly focusing on adaptation. For example, Cambodia and Philippines, and I'll talk a bit more about it in detail. Then you have countries that have developed national climate M&E systems that integrate mitigation and adaptation. And there are very few of those, Kenya being one of them. And we have countries that have developed strong development M&E systems, and they are important cases to learn from, considering that they could be opportunities for considering climate within them as part of measuring the SDG 13. And Colombia and Mexico are some of these cases. We also have cases where countries have developed performance measurement frameworks within the planning and finance ministries, which integrate climate change indicators within them, like Uganda. And then rest of the examples are countries which have a more project-based, fragmented approach. And we won't go into more detail into those. We'll look at more at national M&E systems. Now, can you go to the next slide, please? So Philippines and Cambodia are some of the examples which have both developed national M&E systems to measure adaptation outcomes for the national climate change action plans. So they're backed by a national climate change strategy and a framework. And Philippines particularly has developed a results-based monitoring evaluation system, while Cambodia has a more, it's a national M&E framework for climate change within which adaptation is quite significant. Now, Philippines case is primarily interesting because of the annual monitoring information that is used for national planning, prioritization, and budget setting. So it's not only designed for reporting, but it's more for the internal planning, budget setting process. Also, the evaluation process informs the midterm review of the Philippines development plan. So the case is quite interesting because it's a close link between development reporting and climate change and reporting against the SDGs. There's a Climate Change Commission, which is responsible for developing and implementing the mechanism, and it works quite much in close collaboration with National Economic and Development Authority, which is the overseeing authority for their development planning processes. So the system is quite well integrated with development planning, and it draws upon data gathered at national and subnational levels. There is some level of additional data generation for specific indicators, but most of it is through the existing databases. Cambodia, on the other hand, is quite an interesting example because it tries to assess different parameters needed to assess adaptation outcomes, which includes both the functioning of the governance mechanisms as well as the vulnerabilities of the population. So the framework looks at a suite of variables like the functioning of the governance mechanisms, the context and scale variables on vulnerability, resilience, and adaptive capacity, important elements for the adaptation goal, variables of development performance, and variables of evolving climate conditions and hazards. So it's essentially measuring all the proxies that exist from the commune database, which is the existing database on the adaptation goal. And as I said, it draws on these indicators that track development performance. So both systems offer a fundamental lesson that adaptation M&E can be built around the utilization of existing operational mechanisms. However, they also have their own challenges because they're standalone adaptation M&E systems. They are not always fully embedded within the national development M&E systems. They're quite externally funded through technical assistance. Institutionalizing and governance of M&E can be a challenge because they're donor supported and lack secure and sustained resources to continue. And that can be a challenge for future M&E processes. They have a coordinating body, but that's not a body which has a high convening authority sometimes. So it lacks political clout in terms of bringing together different departments. So often, for example, in case of Cambodia, the sector ministries have been reporting to the coordinating body, but mostly funded through a pilot program. So their own incentive to report against it has been quite weak. And more capacity is needed for these kind of systems to assess these wide suite of adaptation parameters because it can be quite resource intensive to some extent. Unlike Philippines, which has been quite fully integrated into development M&E, Cambodia has not managed to do so. So there are a lot of gaps still, but at the same time, it has proven to create a system which can be harnessed for future planning and reporting. Next slide, please. Kenya, on the other hand, is an interesting example, again a climate M&E, but it brings together, integrates mitigation and adaptation, and also seeks to integrate subnational and national level M&E. The interesting part is each indicator is intended to be quite contextualized, with counties and sectors developing their own operational versions of the indicators. So it's very context specific, and there's high potential for integrating it into development M&E, because the national level vulnerability indicators that have been selected within this are a list of indicators developed for assessing development progress. Again, strong political commitment and a legislative backing makes it a strong program. Having said that, Kenya's case, the implementation has been a challenge. What we know of is that adaptation M&E hasn't made much progress. So the integration didn't prove to be that successful in the same way as it was envisaged, because mitigation M&E probably is going ahead, but adaptation M&E is still lacking, and there's still efforts being made to trigger that. Institutionalization, again, has been a challenge due to lack of secure and sustained resources by the country themselves. And this is something which we see across all national climate M&E systems that exist as separate systems to national development M&E systems. Next slide, please. So to address some of the issues that I mentioned earlier, in addition to national climate and M&E system, we also need to explore more of the development M&E systems, particularly to see how they are sustaining M&E beyond funding from technical assistance, because national climate M&E systems are facing this as a big challenge. For example, if you look at Mexico, Colombia, and South Africa, they all provide example of strong M&E systems, nothing to do with climate change at the moment, but they have managed to sustain beyond donor finance programs. And it's not seen as an additional burden as countries are now investing it themselves into these systems. So these examples are also quite important, particularly because countries are also now trying to find ways to use these existing systems for SDG reporting, particularly for reporting of SDG 13 for climate, particularly in case of Colombia. So both Colombia and Mexico have strong institutional structures for M&E. For example, in Mexico, there's a central body called CONIVAL, and Synergia in Colombia. There are two main bodies with strong central authority. This was a gap that we saw in the earlier M&E systems, where the centralized authority managing M&E of climate was not able to convene or bring together different sectors, whereas in this case, the dedicated nature of these institutions makes them quite powerful. Synergia plays a role in embedding SDGs within development planning, and also measuring climate SDG 13, which is still in its infancy, but it's being operationalized. The success factor of these cases is also that they transition from donor funding to now funding through national budgets. So the system relies heavily on country-led strategy, which increases the likelihood of long-term sustainability. Also, there's high level of political backing, which makes them quite important. There has been a direct mandate and input from the president during each administration. And the primary incentive for the strong political clout is also that the M&E systems can be ensured to and can be used to ensure the efficiency of the public funds, and also sort of democratize the public administration process. So the systems are not really fully operational for measuring SDGs and climate, but the countries are making quite a lot of effort to do so. Next slide, please. In some, I would say that learning from these examples, both the national climate M&E systems and national development systems, we really need to unpack them a bit more to see how the systems can be used for both reporting against these frameworks and also for better national planning. But in these early stages, what we can grasp from them is that as countries get ready to report on different agreements, the existing information that they use can be used for data collection and reporting instead of creating new formats for each country. And this should be the basis of understanding national progress towards adaptation. Also, emphasis on reporting through national data would sort of encourage governments to build up and strengthen their national evaluative systems, which is a better incentive for enabling better learning about adaptation. And finally, looking at these case examples, Cambodia, Philippines, and Kenya, they offer very interesting lessons where existing systems can be used to measure a wide suite of adaptation parameters. These examples also show how you can assess adaptation progress, but they also require investment in capacities, resources, and understanding of robust methods. Also, collecting data from different ministries would require strong central bodies with high convening authority. And lastly, long-term dependence on donor-funded assistance may sort of compromise future reporting, and hence countries could think of funding M&E through national treasury rather than relying on piecemeal funding. As we said, some of these challenges are being overcome by countries like Mexico and Colombia, who have invested in strong development M&E systems, where political backing, legal mandates, institutional authority have ensured sustainability of systems, and countries could learn from such systems for integrated reporting. But one needs to be cautious that granularity in adaptation assessment is not compromised if climate is integrated into development M&E, and that's also quite crucial. So striking a balance between practicality versus getting the right outcomes is equally important while we are thinking of building on these examples of cases. I think that's it from my end, and probably we're going to go into the question and answers, and thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Neha and Nick. Terrific presentations. We have a few questions coming in so far, and again, feel free to just put your questions in the question tab on the right-hand side of your screen. We have a question from Navina Sanchez that says, could you give examples of how in practice adaptation reporting could feed or already feeds into the global level reporting? And Nick, I know you touched upon the idea that this is important for national purposes as well as for international purposes. And I don't know if you would like to take that or Neha, given that you went into some of the country examples and maybe have some thoughts in the countries that you studied on how this is working in practice.
So was that addressed to myself or Neha?
Either one.
Yeah, okay. So my sound cut out just towards the beginning of the question. So if you just want to repeat what the original question was, that would be great.
Sure. Could you give examples of how in practice adaptation reporting is already feeding or could feed into global level reporting?
Right. I think I might want to pass that one over to Neha actually, because I think my impression is that it's quite sort of early days at the moment. There's still a lot of uncertainty about how this is going to happen under, for example, Paris. Neha might have additional information, so I'll pass the buck if I may, Neha. Apologies.
Yeah, sure. I think, as Nick said, it's early days, and not many countries have crystallized how this exactly would happen. However, building on or learning from these existing examples of countries who are already doing, they have started doing some thinking around it, and they mention about it. But I think the second part of this piece of work that we're doing would be unpacking and discussing with uh, the country officials and how they can use the existing system. But one example of these systems, how they can be used for adaptation reporting, would be an example of, say, Cambodia. So Cambodia has been uh, collecting information through its commune database to measure different elements of assessing adaptation. One on improved resilience and uh, reduce vulnerability using a climate vulnerability index, which they have created, which combines different types of development performance indicators, which are collected in the commune database. They also have a set of indicators on institutional capacity assessment. And this, although is a rigorous process, it's less cumbersome than going ahead and collecting bottom level information holistically or extensively. So because you're using the proxies of vulnerability and proxies of resilience to actually define your context specific adaptation parameters, which is not the most ideal way, but at the same time it allows countries to use their existing information to define how they are measuring in terms of adaptation outcomes. So this is one example of where countries can use their existing national M&E frameworks for reporting against parameters of adaptive capacity, improved resilience, and reduced vulnerability.
Terrific. Thanks so much. We have another question for you, Neha. Could you elaborate on the case of Kenya? Which methods are they using for mitigation adaptation co-benefits with their inventories, or how does it work? Or is the monitoring and evaluation a separate one for MRV of action and M&E of adaptation that's hosted by the same entity? And also, just to note, we have a bunch of questions coming in, so if you could keep your response short, that would be great.
Yes, so unfortunately, in the case of Kenya, and there are many experts in the participants I know who know about the Kenya base more than I would also from our GIZ colleagues and others. The Kenya case is specifically it's sort of an isolated adaptation and mitigation case. So mitigation is quite separate from adaptation. Adaptation assessment has its own theory of change, whereas mitigation, so I wouldn't say it's completely integrated, but it's a part of a national framework. And that's the challenge of it, that it's become so that the adaptation has become less implemented in rather than mitigation in this case.
Terrific, thanks. Nick, not a question, but just a comment from Timo Leiter saying UNEP's Adaptation Gap Report 2017 provides a good overview of existing national adaptation M&E systems in Chapter 4, and there's a link there in Timo's comment if anyone wants to look. So another comment, thank you both for your insightful presentations. Both presenters mentioned SDG 13, which covers more disaster risk reduction than adaptation itself. Could you please provide examples of how is the monitoring and evaluation of adaptation linked to other development monitoring and evaluation, particular with other more relevant sectoral SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, such as water, food, settlements, gender? And also, would it be possible to elaborate more on what countries are reporting rather than how they are reporting? So I don't know, Neha, if that's more appropriate for you, or if Nick, you want to chime in as well.
I don't mind. Do you want to take the now, or shall I? Do you want me to say a few words and you to add something?
Yeah, I think you go ahead and then I'll add.
Yeah. So I think at the moment, again, this is something people are maybe struggling with a little bit, is how to join up the M&E of adaptation with sort of wider development reporting. And I think, as they had described, we do have these cases where we have these sort of standalone adaptation M&E systems that are maybe not really linking up or integrating with the wider M&E of development at large. Having said that, there are some examples that we could point to. For example, I know, and again, as Neha said, there'll be people here who probably have been much more intimately connected with what's going on in Kenya, so I defer to anybody with superior knowledge there. But in Kenya, if we look at the adaptation indicators that have been identified for the national and the county level, then they are taken from a set of broader development indicators. So there's a conscious effort there to use development or development relevant indicators to track adaptation. So this is really taking elements of development that are particularly relevant to adaptation and using those in adaptation M&E frameworks. And then in Colombia, I believe this is where the sort of reporting or the M&E has been focusing on, in particular, SDG 13. But my understanding is that that's been focused largely on sort of evaluations, individual evaluations of initiatives and programs to see how they're addressing that and other SDGs, rather than the development of specific indicator frameworks that might be tracked over time, for example. So it's sort of, again, as with everything to do with adaptation M&E, and I guess adaptation at large, it's still a very much an emerging area, and it can be quite frustrating to look for specific areas of where something is being done in a particular way and done well, and we can learn lessons from it and use that as a template for other successful action. People are still learning how to do this stuff. But Neha, do you want to add anything there?
Yes, I think I agree with Nick. As Nick says, people are still learning, and it will be too early to say what countries are reporting rather than how they will be reporting, because whatever we mentioned in our presentations was how countries can use their existing system for reporting rather than saying they are using for reporting. So it's too preliminary to say how they are doing it. But we did mention that Colombia has been thinking of reporting for SDG 13, which the person who has asked the question said SDG 13 is only for DRR, but I think it's more climate action, which includes both adaptation and mitigation. So if you see these examples, countries which have been investing in sectoral M&E linked to national M&E, for example, in case of Cambodia, you have they've been investing in the public works and transport M&E, and then agriculture and health, which then links up to the national climate M&E. These are three main areas which are being considered for reporting against the SDGs as well. So that links up together. Having said that, it's not operational at the moment. These are just wishful thinking of possible ways it could be done.
Terrific, thanks. Let's take one more question. Just a quick comment. Joaquim had asked why any French country in Africa is not participating in the program. Just a note, and we'll talk about the next set of webinars. The format of the webinars change, and sometimes we have representatives from international institutions present. Sometimes it's a mix of countries as well. So depending on the webinar structure, that differs. But in the future, we'll also have some country representatives. Just one question from Eliza. Each adaptation policy is financed by a specific institute, so it has its own monitoring and evaluation indicators. But how is this monitoring and evaluation used to learn up on the government level and down on the community level? So I think this is just a question of vertical integration and how that learning occurs both at the national level down to the community level. Either of you, if you want to take that.
Okay, not sure which one I'll sort of take that. Again, maybe I'll start and hand over to Neha. So this sort of vertical integration is a key challenge. So how do we track adaptation at the small scales at which a lot of adaptation is going to take place? And how do we somehow feed this up or aggregate it so it makes sense at the national level and even at the international level? So this is sort of a critical question, I think, for particularly if we're looking at things like how we track the extent to which adaptation policies and actions are improving people's resilience on the ground. So again, if we take, for example, the Kenya case, then there is a very, very deliberate effort there to marry the sort of the top-down national level indicators with the bottom-up county level indicators, and for the one to feed into the other. And the framework exists there, but my understanding is that at the moment that's not actually being implemented. So it's sort of stuck, as it were, probably because actually it's quite a complicated undertaking that needs to be replicated over a number of different, a large number of different counties, and then integrated at the national level. So people are sort of looking at this, but again, it's going to be the typical lazy refrain that it's early days, and it's sort of difficult to find examples of where this is really being done sort of effectively. There are sort of frameworks and indicators that you know, in principle could help to do this. For example, under the UK's International Climate Fund, there are indicators based on numbers of people supported to cope with climate change and the numbers of people with improved resilience. So in principle, you can aggregate those numbers and add them up at the national level, but you still have to look at the specific context. What is it that you mean by supported to cope in a particular area or locality in relation to a particular program, and what is it that makes people more resilient, and how do you measure that? So again, lots and lots of challenges, but Neha, please feel free to add anything.
Yeah, I think you covered it well, Nick.
Terrific, thanks. And there was one comment by Heidi just saying, is there any page where we can be updated about these topics? And I'm wondering, Nick and Neha, if you have any page for your projects or any other institutions that are working on this that could be helpful resources, maybe you could just type that into the chat function for everyone to see. If there are pages where they can continue to learn about that. And obviously, I am sure that both Nick and Neha would be more than welcome to answer any further specific questions. And actually, in related to that, we didn't actually get through all of the list of questions. So you may want to take a few minutes at the end, Nick and Neha, just to see if you want to type some answers to the remaining questions that we did.
Okay. Perhaps we could also invite Timo as well to do that. I know Gianna said is a good source to go to for this sort of knowledge. So
terrific, that would be wonderful. Yes, please, Timo, feel free to come in here. Terrific. If you go to the next slide, Pauline, please. Great. On behalf of both TASCA and POTBA, I'd like to thank our panelists and participating for joining. And if you've enjoyed today's webinar, I would encourage you to visit our webpage to learn more about our webinar series and watch past webinar recordings and register for future webinars. Our next webinar is scheduled for Thursday, October 25th at 9 a.m. Eastern time, where we'll be hearing about measuring non-state and subnational climate action, aggregation, and integration. This webinar is going to explore how can we determine the potential impacts of climate commitments from cities, businesses, and other non-state actors. We'll also hear from panelists who will share their experience in undertaking such assessments and how the results can help inform greater action and ambition. We hope you'll be able to join us, and to register for this webinar, please visit our website where you can also find the latest information on future webinars. If you go to the last slide, please. Again, please contact us and Nick and Neha if you have any questions about today's webinar or the series. And thank you all again. Again, at the close of this webinar, a short survey is going to launch for you to answer some very quick questions about this webinar. So if you could take a few seconds to do that, that would be much appreciated. And thanks again, and we wish you all a very good day and evening, for depending on where you are. Thank you.
thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.